vital records, the definitions. These are most of the terms that you'll run across when you deal with vital records. This next one is a chart that tells when each of the different records started being kept by each of the 50 states. And this last one comes in real handy. It's a checklist of all the different types of records that you can look for. That doesn't mean all of them exist, but this is a good checklist to reference the different types of records to go and find for all of your genealogy research. So, vital records are the cornerstone of family history research because they typically are created at or near the time of the event, making the records more likely to be accurate. Vital records are records of life events important enough that government agencies, So vital records are records of life events important enough that government agencies organize and preserve them. Researchers use the term to refer specifically to birth, marriage, divorce, and death. Since at least the Middle Ages, governments have considered these events so significant that they are required by law to be recorded in some type of official ledger, generally accessible by the public. In most of the U.S., a clerk in the city, town, or county government maintains the records. Since early in the 20th century, each state also recorded these events. As a general guideline, if the event occurred before 1900, the local community would be the best place to seek the vital records. If it occurred after 1900, either the local or state level would be a good place to start. New England town clerks recorded vital statistics as early as the 1600s. In other locations, such as the southern and western states, vital records were first recorded in the late 1800s or early 1900s. Now keep in mind, much of this depends on when a city, town, county, and or state was formed. Included in your handout is the table that I told you about. The information recorded on vital records will vary and are not the same for all records. The material depends very much on the location, the time, and the place the event occurred. A close reading of vital records can sometimes reveal essential factors other than the bare bones basics. You will need to explore beyond indexes of vital records. In all cases, do not assume the ancestor lived where the event occurred. Crossing county lines or even state lines was very common. Birth. The original purpose of records. The original purpose of vital statistics was for tax purposes and for the determination of available military manpower. Births were initially registered with churches who maintain registers of birth. Birth registration opens the door to rights to children and adults, which many other human beings take for granted, to prove their age, to prove their nationality, to receive health care, to go to school, to take exams, to be adopted, to protection from underage military service or conscription, to marry, to open bank accounts, to hold a driver's license, to obtain a passport, to inherit money or property, and to vote or stand for elected office. The federal and state governments have traditionally cooperated to some extent to improve vital statistics. From 1900 to 1946, the U.S. Census Bureau designed standard birth certificates, collected vital statistics on a national basis, and generally sought to improve the accuracy of vital statistics. In 1946, that responsibility was passed to the U.S. Public Health Service. Birth records are considered primary proof of date and place of birth, the sex, and the parents. However, one must distinguish between a birth record that reports the biological parents and the birth records for an adopted child. This record will not show that the child is adopted. This particular birth certificate actually happens to be a hospital birth certificate. That's mine. And it's got all sorts of neat letters. I got my little footprints on there and my parents' name and everything. And you don't see too many hospital certificates anymore. The maiden name of the mother has a high genealogical value, for it provides a clue to a third generation surname. The two-generation relationship, parent to child, is of special value as it records legal, although not necessarily biological parents. The advent of DNA.
Down is up and up is back.
Okay, I got two screens. I was looking at the wrong one. That was my fault. The advent of DNA is proving that fact. under law, unless paternity is denied by the legal father, the husband of the mother is listed as the biological father. Birth certificates also often give parents' ages and/or dates and places of birth. There may also be a question concerning if the birth was legitimate. If this is the mother's first child, how many she may have had and how many are still living. Some birth certificates record if the birth was single or multiple. Parents' occupation may also be listed. These are transcripts from, let's see, we got one from the 1930s, one from 1784 that shows the mother's first name, no maiden name, although it actually is supposed to list both, and an application to register a birth in 1896. Delayed registration of births are for persons born before registration began, typically after 1935 with the inception of Social Security. These list the sources of information proving the facts and can spark further research. The one that says dated 1972 for birth in 1917, that is actually my paternal grandmother's. It does say deceased across the top of it because at the time that I requested it, she was already dead. But she was adopted when she was 3 years old, and so I can't get her original birth certificate because it wasn't recorded. She did not actually file for a birth certificate until 1950. So one is 1917, and the other one for my grandmother, she was actually born in 1907. Records may be amended at a later date where a change is made to the official document. Someone of record, the parent, adult child, or government entity, made an official correction to the record, such as name change, error on the records, filling in additional filling in additional information. This is one of my granddaughter's birth certificate. When they filled it out, they put the wrong state for my son's birth, so they had to come back and correct it. And the letter over there shows that it is amended, and it corresponds with official record of vital records. Now, in Alabama, no births were recorded by government agencies prior to 1881. Starting in 1881, the state of Alabama required individual counties to register the birth of children. Because most counties were slow to comply, not all births were recorded. In addition, many records from this time period are missing or were destroyed. Birth registers from this time period usually do not list the name of the child. To obtain copies of birth records from this time period, contact the county court where births occurred. The state of Alabama required the registration of births on a state level beginning in 1908. Early registration in this time period was sketchy. Most births were recorded by 1927. Early birth registers and certificates generally do not contain the name of the child, but may contain other important information. It is more common to find the child's name by the 1920s. Birth certificates are confidential for 125 years following the date of birth. So unless you can prove that you're a direct descendant and have a need, you can't get your birth certificate. They've been dead for 125 years following the birth. In the United States, when an adoption is finalized, the government seals the original birth certificate and will issue a replacement birth certificate, substituting the individual's birth name with the name selected by the adoptive parents and replacing the birth parents' names with the adoptive parents. In those cases, adopted individuals are not granted access to their own original birth certificate upon request. Laws vary depending on the state where the birth was originally registered and the adoption was finalized. Some states allow adopted people unrestricted access to their own birth certificates, while in others the certificate is available only if the biological parents have given their permission or a petition has been granted by the court of jurisdiction. Other jurisdictions do not allow adopted people access to their own birth certificates under any circumstance. In many cases, children were raised by relatives or interested family members without formal adoption taking place and no official adoption records being created. In my ex-husband's family, his paternal grandparents had 8 children, and his grandmother's sister never had children. She couldn't have them. So his grandmother gave her sister her sixth child to raise as their own. And in the 1940 census, he's listed with both his birth parents and his foster parents or adoptive parents, since it wasn't a legal adoption. So he's actually listed twice in the 1940 census. Children of an early marriage may have taken on the name of their stepfather. And quick name changes can and did occur in early census reports when census takers recorded the name of the head of the household and the children's names without verifying if they were the same name. In the top example, in the 1900 census, the household was a name of Smith, and in 1910, the head of house was deceased, his wife had remarried, and all children of the previous household are now listed with the second husband's last name. So they changed names just by census. In your handout, you should have an adoption tip. That just gives you more information about adoptions. Now, as I told you earlier, that delayed certificate, my paternal grandmother was adopted as a toddler, and her parents changed her name after the adoption, but her younger birth brother was also adopted as an infant, and when his adoptive parents petitioned for him, his initial records show a name change from Harold William to Forrest Harold. The family later returned to court verifying the child was never known by his adopted name, but had always been known by his birth name. So he actually had two separate names, but he was always known by his birth name.
So did that create any problems with the federal government or employers? You're not using your legal name?
No, because it was changed when he was still fairly young.
Okay.
So there was
a question.
Yeah.
Where it says certificates are confidential for 125 years following the date of birth, who can access? I mean, I know the person can access their own birth certificate. Who else can have access to it?
Parents.
Parents, and that's all, no grandparents?
Generally not. Again, it varies from state to state. Like I said, with my grandmother's, she was deceased when I requested it, so there was not a problem with that one, because it may have been 125 years by the time I asked for it, because she was born in early 1900s, and I didn't ask for it until maybe early 2000s. So.
And I think that's one of the distinctions there too. If a person is deceased and you can prove that they're deceased, then a child or grandchild can actually order it as well. I've been able to order the birth certificates for all four of my grandparents, but I had to do each after they had passed away.
I think it would be next of kin, but you might have to prove you are the next of kin.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, Debbie's brother passed away, and she was able to get his birth certificate.
Well, I got his birth certificate prior to him passing.
Well, then he could have given permission for it. I mean, it just, again,
No, I
it's,
just went down there and
yeah, it
I
varies
think
from,
they matched our parents.
yeah, it varies from
With my ID.
state to state on what they actually say. So marriage is a major part of family history and genealogy. After all, there wouldn't be a family without a union, whether it is legally confirmed or not. When putting your family tree together, one of the first things you look for is the marriage information. Who got married to whom, when, and where. Our American ancestors kept marriage records from colonial times. The government needed to ensure that children who inherited their parents' property were legitimate, that people didn't marry close relatives, that nobody was married to more than one person at the same time, and that both parties were above the legal age of consent, or if not, had the consent of their parents or legal guardians. Anyway. Not all information on a marriage record is truthful. People lied. Remember that. People lied. My father's maternal great-grandmother testified that her daughter was 17 years old when she married, and that's in the that's right here. She said she was 17 years old when she married. She was actually only 15, because the 1900 census shows she's 11 years old. So marriage was recorded in 1904, so she had not, in 4 years, she had not gone from 11 to 17. So her mother lied. Because her mother's a woman that actually signed the register saying that. Due to the importance of legal marriage, and its relation to inheritance, marriage records were typically kept in some form even before statewide registration was required. Most county marriage records began when the county is formed. Marriages were often the last vital record collected at the state level. Massachusetts began requiring statewide marriage records in 1841, but Washington and Nevada did not do so until 1968. Marriages are generally considered to be religious events, thus you would want to look for marriages in church records. Depending on the denomination, you may find several mentions of the marriage in the church records. The amount of detail in church records varies greatly depending on the denomination. It is certainly worth looking for the record since you never know what you may find. And don't overlook the opportunity to find other family members by analyzing the witnesses. Check out all the participants to see how they are related or associated with the bride and groom. These may be just clues you need to flesh out the family. Marriages have always been a public covenant recorded in a variety of ways, including banns, bonds, licenses, newspaper announcements, and church and civil records. Many early marriage records can be found in state archives, and our more recent records will be found at the Division of Vital Records or several government agencies. Some states allow a couple who didn't want to pay for a license to post banns for 3 consecutive Sundays in local churches. Banns announced a couple's intention to marry and gave the community time to object to the union. After the ceremony, the officiant returned the record of marriage to the courthouse. Returns are either filed or entered into a bound of marriage registers. This is just another explanation of marriage bans. After the bride and groom agreed to marry, they had to obtain a license or post banns. A marriage license gave permission to a justice of the peace, rabbi, or minister to marry a couple. In some states, primarily in the South, grooms had to place themselves under bond before they married. 1 or 2 other men acted as surety to the bond. The bond money was meant to defray court expenses if a planned marriage were not to take place. Men who stood surety to the groom were frequently the bride's father or brother, or otherwise connected to her family. Surety was rarely from the groom's family. The marriage record states the marriage took place. Make sure the record states the marriage has already happened and is not awaiting a marriage return, which is confirmation for the officiating official. Recording marriages can appear in different forms. There's a register of marriage, a record of marriage, and then two different record books. So they can come in almost any format. Most marriages took place in the location most convenient to the bride. Marriage records historically were filed in the bride's county of residence. If the groom lived in another county, start your search where the bride was from. If you cannot find the record there, move on to the groom's home area. If you are still unlucky at locating the record, examine the geography of the area, looking for natural barriers that would force them away from the nearest courthouse to another, and then look there. There is no legal requirement to go to a specific jurisdiction for marriage. Once all possibilities are exhausted, start checking near the homes of all known relatives. Perhaps they were visiting someone. If that does not produce results, then check out marriage laws of the time and area where they lived and the surrounding areas. Marriage laws differ from state to state. I was living in Pensacola at the time I got married, but I was actually married in Baldwin County, Alabama, because in Florida you had to be 21, female had to be 21 to marry without the parents' permission, but only 18 in Alabama, so we crossed state lines to get married. And my oldest granddaughter was married in Lincoln County, Tennessee, but her marriage record is actually filed in Sevier County because that was the only courthouse open on a Saturday for them to get their marriage license. And the officiant lived in Sparta, Tennessee. So on a note about incorrect information, my granddaughter listed her father, my son, his place of birth is Pennsylvania when he was actually born in South Carolina. Not sure why, but she pulled it out in her memory from something. So her marriage record actually states that her daddy was born in Pennsylvania. So this one talks about marriage gaps where you may have multiple spouses and the time from one ends to the other begins. So was there time for another marriage? That'll help you look for different last names. To find marriage records for the area of interest, consult the handy book or red book to see when the county started keeping these records. Also check Family Search to see if there were circuit rider records for a traveling preacher who may have left diaries of his marriages performed. Check the newspapers around the time of the wedding and on significant anniversaries like the 10th, the 25th, or 50th to see if there's a story about the couple or the wedding. In Alabama, in 1799, a law passed in the Mississippi Territory, which includes present-day Alabama, requiring marriage licenses and bonds to be registered in the orphans court in the county of the bride's residence. To obtain copies of the original marriage records, contact the probate court in the county where the license was issued. Marriage licenses and bonds were registered in the orphans court, renamed probate court in 1850 in the county. Starting in 1888, bonds were only required if the groom was under the age of 21 or the bride was under the age of 18. To obtain copies of original marriage records, contact probate court in the county where the license was issued, or contact the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And Alabama started keeping statewide marriage records in August of 1936. On to divorce. Before 1900, divorce was very rare, in some areas even illegal. Early divorces were not always documented, but the information that can be obtained in the papers makes them worth pursuing. A divorced couple's marriage date and place would be included in the divorce papers. In the past, a disenchanted spouse had to convince a judge or an entire state legislature, or both, to undo a marriage. What went awry in the relationship may be documented in almost uncomfortable detail. The couple's entire backstory may be there too. When and where they married, the names and ages of their kids, their financial assets, and where they lived. Until about the mid-1800s, courts and specific acts of state legislature granted divorces. In 1866, the U.S. federal government declared that a legislative divorce was illegal. Since then, divorce has been a civil action that local courts determine. Early marriage records don't necessarily ask about prior marital history. A divorced person making a fresh start may have identified himself or herself as widowed or single. Divorce didn't always immediately follow a separation or even precede the next wedding. Divorce was socially undesirable and expensive, especially in the distant past, not a sure thing. Legal grounds for granting divorce were often strict and difficult or humiliating to prove. Divorce records in the 19th century can be difficult to locate. While in earlier days of the 19th century, some divorces were decreed by statewide legislative bodies. The reality is most were decreed by county level courts. The difficulty is knowing in which county of the state the divorce was filed. For families that move frequently, determining where the divorce was initiated can be even more difficult. Residency requirements before filing for a divorce varied from one state to another, and divorces were not easy or cheap. There's usually no statewide index to divorce records, so their location requires knowing the county in which the divorce took place, and to the appropriate court's records to be searched. Initial searches should focus on the counties where the individuals were known to live. Some ways to get around the lack of knowledge are searching for a reference to the divorce in digital images of newspapers, searching for all military pension records of the couple and other spouses they had for potential references to a divorce, searching land and property records in the county where a couple owned property to see if there were any land transactions that suggested a couple divorced or permanently separated. Not every couple that separated got a divorce. Some chose to live apart. In some cases, one or both former spouses married again, divorced or not. My father's maternal grandfather was abandoned by his first wife, left him with 3 young children. In later census records, he reported his status as widow, although his wife did not die until 1971. Both remarried, I believe without courtesy of a divorce, because I've never found one. This was prior to 1915, so who could prove the truth? Claiming to be widowed is not an uncommon status on census records, as divorce was often considered shameful, embarrassing, degrading, especially for women. In a recent conversation between 4 members of my DAR chapter, it revealed that each of us had an ancestor who claimed to be widowed when in truth they were either separated, divorced, or abandoned. Most states did away with legislative divorce by 1867. In 1852, Indiana allowed divorce for any proper reason. It had liberal residency requirements and did not require serving papers personally to the spouse. Utah, the Dakotas, and Oklahoma became go-to states for fast divorces. South Carolina didn't grant any divorce until after a constitutional change in 1949. Legislative divorces, if an original document still exists, there may be in the state archives or library or in special archives of the legislature itself. They generally weren't published. If a divorce was granted, legislators drew up a private law which should appear among other statutes passed during the time period. Courtroom divorces, almost all U.S. divorces after 1900 and many before then, included all divorces in New England were courtroom divorces. In a judicial divorce, so-called because a judge presides, the person seeking a divorce filed a complaint. The original complaint, along with any response, should be in the case files or loose papers for the divorce. A list of actions or filings should appear in the court docket books organized by case. In Alabama, divorces come under an entirely different jurisdiction than do birth, death, and marriage records. Birth and death are commonly maintained by health departments and marriage records by the branch of the county government. In Alabama, marriage records are located in the office of the probate judge. Divorces, however, are a result of a court action, and in many states, records are maintained as court records, and the state office has only an index. In Alabama, divorce records at present are maintained by the county or district court clerk. In earlier days, divorces required legislative action. Sometime in the 1830s, divorce was shifted to district or circuit court. Prior to 1950, divorces could be granted by state legislature, circuit courts, city courts, and county chancery courts. In 1950, the county chancery courts were merged with the county circuit courts. Divorces finalized by the state legislature can be found published in Alabama legislative journals. To locate divorce records for this time period, contact the clerk of circuit court in the county where the divorce was granted. In January 1950, Alabama started keeping statewide divorce records. Contact Alabama Department of Public Health to obtain divorce records for this time period. Ancestry also has an index for divorces granted between 1950 and 1959. So then we go on to death. Death certificates are perhaps the most unreliable of vital records. Perhaps the person reporting the death is unable to answer questions or is in such an emotional state that he or she does not give the correct information. The deceased age and parents' names and birthplaces might be close enough to point you in the right direction, but they also might be very far off the mark. In the case of my father's maternal grandfather, the information was provided, yes, in 1938 in Missouri, was provided by his fourth wife. They had only been married 18 months when he died. She didn't know anything about his family, hence the unknown for parents. And if I didn't already know about the family line, this death certificate would be a brick wall, other than learning his death information, for there were no parents or other hints for going back a generation. And from a personal perspective, having a genealogist or family historian available when providing information at the time of death comes in very useful. 13 years ago, when our father died, my youngest sister and I were at hand to complete the information for his death certificate. She was at loss for answers, more because she didn't know them than due to grief. Birthplace, parents' names, their place of birth, number of years living in the city, county, all that information was easily accessible from working with my father's family's history. So filling out his death certificate, I provided all of them from the top of my head because I knew Daddy's information. Information that can or might be found on a death certificate include the deceased name, date, and place of death. Often the birth date and place of residence and marital status, and maybe some information on the spouse. The attending physician, if present, and information on burial. On some of the older death certificates, cause of death is listed. Laws have changed and newer death certificates are no longer issued with cause of death. And for other information that can be found on a death certificate is military service. So look to see if an ancestor died in a veterans hospital or was buried in a national cemetery. Tips on how to find a death certificate.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
You got all this stuff at your fingertips on like this death stuff, right? I noticed that like when I be looking online, let's just say like they'll post something like a picture of somebody, and they'll say they're trying to contact the public to find out the relatives of a deceased person. Why ain't they using the same stuff that you have access to?
Well,
They're trying to find like the next of kin.
well, generally in a case like that, it's legal, and they'll go any avenue they can, because if there's an estate, they have to track down every single descendant of that person. And there's some people that simply don't know, and so they're using the most public forum they can. I just happen to know I've been doing my genealogy since the early 1990s.
Wow.
So I've compiled a lot of records, vital, the birth certificates, marriage certificates, that sort of thing, as well as census records and land records and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I've got 3-ring binders, the 4-inch ones. I've got 2 shells of them.
Wow.
No, I've got 3 shells of them,
Wow.
because I've got that much information that go back generations. Sometimes it only may be in one document or 2, but I got quite a bit of information because I've been doing a lot of research.
So you're an expert then?
No, I'm not an expert, but I've been doing it a while.
Yeah, that's a lot of years of experience though.
On this one, it was talking. It says here they may have gone shopping across the county or state line, and you wonder why would someone be shopping in another state? And this was, I live near the Tennessee-Alabama state line, and I live in Tennessee. It's a 2-hour drive for me to get down here. But I frequently shop in the nearest town in Alabama on my way to or from home. And I have a great grandfather who died in Kansas but was buried in Iowa in the same cemetery as his spouse. My mother died in Virginia, but she's buried in Missouri next to her parents. So her death certificate will be in Virginia, but her grave is actually in Missouri. So you can't find them. You're not always going to find them where an event happened. So in Alabama, before 1881, no deaths were recorded by government agencies in Alabama. Starting in 1881, the state of Alabama required individual counties to register death. Because most counties were slow to comply, not all deaths are recorded. In addition, many records from this time period are missing or were destroyed. Starting in January of 1908, Alabama state law required the registration of all deaths occurring within the state. Copies of death certificates were filed with the Alabama Center for Health Statistics. Information found on the death certificate is reported by an informant, usually a relative, and may or may not be accurate.
And as far as I know, Lauderdale and Colbert have no 1881 vital records, but Limestone County does.
For African Americans, when searching for birth, marriage, or death records after the Civil War, check the record types listed above. Birth, marriage, and death information for African Americans prior to the Civil War can be found in other sources. And if you check online, look up Alabama minorities for more information. Native Americans, in order to find their birth, marriage, or death information, living in Alabama, you must know which tribe the individual belonged to. Indians of Alabama has more specific information about the tribes in the state. So again, you have to look up Indian tribes in Alabama to get that information. So here's a list of some places to get it. I would tell you, if you don't know, I would go to Cindy's List first. Cindy's List is a huge database on all sorts, and it should be listed in your bibliography of your handout. But she's got a list of states, what's available in different states. She's got a list by surname. She's got all different things. Otherwise, go to Family Search and look up the information on vital records in their wikis. And these others are just some places that I have actually gone out looking for vital records.
What did you say the one was called for African Americans?
Oh, it's called Alabama Minorities.
Alabama Is it dot .org?
No, I just looked up Alabama minorities
Big lie.
and then followed the links that they provided me. You're gonna have to write, most times you're gonna either have to go by and visit in person to get your vital records, or you'll have to write. So it just be concise. Don't give your whole family history. They don't have time to read it. They don't care. There are a lot of forms online that you can fill out and then mail to them. And there are a lot of different substitutes for vital records. So partial substitutes can be Social Security Death Index, the original Social Security application in SS5, newspaper births and marriage announcements, newspaper obituaries, Bibles, tombstone, census records, military records. And here you got a church baptismal record, and church baptismal records will tell you when the child's baptized and not when it was born, but they were generally baptized within a certain period of time after their birth. There's tombstones, civil registration cards. The picture is one of my younger sisters. And then right below that is new arrivals that I got out of my local paper just not too long ago. And right next to it, the one that's circled, is actually my birth announcement in the paper. And then the other one is not an actual marriage record. This was a church record. So other information that may be gleaned from a certificate is an ancestor's religious preference, even if not specifically stated. Who performed the ceremony? A Catholic priest, a Lutheran pastor, a rabbi? Was the ancestor buried in a Catholic cemetery or some other denomination? Information listed on vital records is given by an informant. Learn the relationship of the informant to the subject of the record. The closer the relationship of the informant to the subject, and whether or not the informant was present at the time of the event, can help you determine the accuracy of information found on the records. If you are unable to locate vital records recorded by governments, search church records for christening, marriage, death, or burial records. A family Bible may also have been used to record family births, marriage, and death. Pay attention to the publication date of Bibles versus the date recorded. Earlier dates may have been copied from elsewhere or from someone's memories. Dates after are more likely to be accurate. Ownership and chain of possession can also help solidify the validity of the information. Records for African Americans are often recorded in separate files with separate indexes. Privacy laws may restrict your access to some vital records. Copies of some vital records recorded in the last 100 years may be unavailable except to direct descendants. If the survival of a baby was questioned, the birth may not have been recorded. Until the beginning of statewide registration, I hit the wrong button. So there's your big reality. County or town clerks filed marriage records in the county courthouse or town hall. At the courthouse, these records could be maintained by several different offices, including probate court, orphans court, clerk of court, county clerk, register of deeds, and the district court. Statewide registration of marriages is handled by either State Department of Health or Vital Statistics. Remember that what the state required and what was enforced at the local level are often two different things. So when you write off for copies, most agencies will only process a request for 1 or 2 vital records at a time. You may have to combine several different types of records to receive the full picture of a date, place, and lineage, parent, spouse, children. Finds from vital records often need to be combined with information from other sources to solve brick wall puzzles. Last thought. Birth, marriage, death, and divorce records provide the basic or primary source for your research. If you're lucky, you can find much more. So remember, patience pays when looking for records or requesting for copies of records. Any questions?